Good morning, everybody. It's time for another military history Q&A. I'm going to do two interesting questions. Jay asked the first one, did the Japanese ever honestly invade the United States mainland during World War II? And if they did, was it a cruel joke? Yes, and probably. And the second question we'll get to after that is about the Masonic conspiracy of dastardly Masons being viciously hunted by the Nazis, trying to take over the world through banking, or not. I'm not going to do a conspiracy video, don't worry. I'm going to break down what actually happened to the Masons in Germany, because George Davis wants to know. And somebody, don't know who, once made a movie where the subplot was a couple of German Masons hiding in the German army being chased by the Gestapo all over the Eastern Front. Don't know who would make such a silly movie. But a lot of questions came up about it, and it's about time we address it. And there's some editorial at the end, so you may as well hang on for the ride and have a drink. Anyway, let's start with the first question. Did the Japanese ever honestly invade the U.S. mainland? Yes, they actually did, which is very counterintuitive, and a lot of smart Japanese probably knew this was a bad idea. They did. In 1942, in June, they invaded parts of mainland United States and held on for some 12-13 months. But let me take you to a cold, miserable, wet, rocky outcropping of a place first. The Aleutian Islands. It's about 1,200-mile long island chain stretching between Alaska and Russia. Actually, from the Alaska Peninsula to the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. It was originally discovered by Russian fur traders. It is a mountainous, volcanic rock outcropping sitting in the middle of nowhere. It is cold, miserable, windy. There are no trees. It rains and snows and it's foggy. And for those who call it home, well, I'm sorry if I just insulted your home, but it really doesn't sound like a very nice and comfortable place. Sorry. Anyway, it was. And the Japanese did this after Pearl Harbor had proven not exactly decisive in ridding the Japanese Empire of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And they have poked a rather angry American population by bombing their fleet unannounced. So America was very committed to the war. And why did Japan decide to invade a small island chain up there somewhere where there were a few American bases? I'm going to try to break it down as to why I thought they did it, because from the outset, it doesn't seem to make any sense. Tactically, strategically, seemed to be a waste of resources that could be possibly spent better. But there might have been a little bit of reason to it. Let's break down the events and just go over what actually happened. It all started some 150, 200 miles away with the Battle of Dutch Harbor, where the Naval Operation Base and the U.S. Army Fort Meade was stationed at Dutch Harbor on Almanac Island. And on June 3rd and 4th, 1942, the two Japanese carriers, a handful of small destroyers, decided to launch an attack. They were under command of Admiral Kakuya. Maybe. I'm sorry, my Japanese pronunciation is quite horrible. He was in command of a small naval task force, which included the two carriers, Ryū and Yūnyo, which I also probably pronounced horribly wrong. Just before dawn at 2:58, they launched a small air group to attack the American bases in the harbor. 12 A6M0s, 10 B5NK bombers, and 12 D3A Val dive bombers took off from the two carriers in an extremely freezing cold water to strike out at Dutch Harbor. One B5N was lost on takeoff from the Ryū. Now, the initial attacks did not damage the U.S. bases horribly much. There were, after all, not that many of them. The interesting thing here was the U.S. have had some indication that there was a task force on the way up in that general neighborhood to do some sort of mischief. And mind you, however, this was pretty much in the middle of the Battle of Midway, which was taking place between the 4th and the 7th of June. So the Japanese attacked and then invaded these small Alaskan islands in the middle of the Battle of Midway with, like I said, a few destroyers and 2 small escort carriers. Not the best carrier force, but one would have wondered what they could have contributed to the Battle of Midway had they been there instead. However, they bombed the Dutch harbor bases, and over that night the defensive pulled in anti-aircraft weaponry. The civilian population, there's small down there, believe it or not, pulled together, filled sandbags, and prepared for either an invasion or another bombing, which came the next day because there were several attacks on the 3rd and the 4th where they bombed Dutch harbor in various ways. And there's quite a few accounts on this. There was some damage, obviously, done, but none of the Japanese ships were harmed. A few planes were shot down. One important event that probably was more important than the rest of this whole debacle was a Mitsubishi Zero was damaged. The pilot was killed as he crash-landed on Akutan Island, about 20 miles away, northeast of Dutch harbor. Now, this plane crash-landed pretty much intact. And this was the first full copy or full intact version of the Zero that the Americans could lay their hands on. This was eventually restored and put back to flying and tested by the U.S. military to figure out exactly what devil in the sky they're dealing with. So putting an intact Zero in the hands of the U.S. military was probably more of a gift than the nuisance that this campaign was. But make no mistake, this was an actual war. This was a real battle. This was not just a little skirmish, although it was a sideshow to the broader picture of the war, obviously, and the Battle of Midway. That went horribly wrong for the Japanese. Certainly stole all the thunder. But yet, propaganda-wise, the Japanese landed on American soil with 500 Marines. They took the 10 defending troops somewhat by surprise and hoisted their flag over that island of Attu and Kiska. Now, after 2 days of attacking Dutch harbor, Admiral Katua received orders to break off and go home, and he headed back for the Central Pacific Fleet in order to join up with the rest of the fleet that had just been defeated at Midway, so this might have been a good time to recall the carriers back to the Pacific where things were not going that well. And just out of interest, the Ryū was sunk on August 24th. It was torpedoed in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and the Yunyu was torpedoed and repaired and bombed and repaired. And at the time the war ended, she was sitting in docked because it really wasn't worth it for the Japanese to fix her. And the U.S. occupying force looked at this ship pretty much the same way, so she was broke up and scrapped in 46 or 7. Just point of interest. Anyway, 2 days after they were done bombing Dutch harbor, Japanese landed a small invasion force, first on Attu and then on Kiska. Not really much fighting was going on since there really was not a whole lot of American forces on the ground there. Which again, where would they have come from? The Alaskan command could not possibly have comprised of a whole lot of troops and soldiers. So even if the Americans now knew that they were in the neighborhood, couldn't really have done much to reinforce or bring up a force to counter this. I would suppose it was a bit of a surprise that the Japanese would do this, being relatively far from their homeland and of relatively low strategic importance. The initial American response to this was, well, not really much, because they were busy fighting everywhere else, and having a handful of Japanese sitting up on an island in the middle of nowhere really did not seem like the biggest and first priority, although as it came to propaganda-wise, well, it's kind of sucky that they are on our soil, and bombers were sent to harass and bomb the Japanese over the next 11 months. But slowly and gradually, the American logistics started turning their attention towards them, and just like any other invasion island hopping campaign, we started moving troops closer and closer so we could eventually kick the Japanese off our islands. Now the islands are, shall we say, unhospitable, miserable, cold, and the Japanese there, however, was well prepared for this. They were well planned, they were well equipped, and initially they were well supplied. They dug in a whole lot of bunkers, underground fortifications, and a submarine base, which is interesting, we'll get back to, although mostly miniature submarines were captured when the islands eventually fell. Spoiler alert, eventually we take them back. Sorry. It was kind of in the cards. I don't think it's a secret by now that Japan loses that particular war. So, I keep wanting to go back to submarine bases in the Alaskan islands. Even though they had miniature submarines there with a range of about 450 miles, which is not a lot, certainly couldn't reach the U.S. mainland or San Francisco. We'll get back to that. So, they are setting up, they're preparing, and eventually they swell to 5,000 to 7,000 Japanese troops stationed on these two islands, fortifying them quite well, initially being well supplied. When we fast forward to March in 1943, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid is getting close to having a bit of enough, and it's time to eradicate. Also remember, the U.S. naval expansion and building is fast underway now, and we'll have more and more soldiers, more and more Navy ships available to divert to this little diversion. Anyway, Kinkaid set up a blockade of these islands, as he should, because the Japanese were supplying them quite readily. And on March 1926, Japanese ships at the Bering Seas who were attempting to deliver reinforcements and supplies finally got harrowed by U.S. vessels. They had a little battle. It was a battle of the Komodorsky Islands. That must be a throwback to the Russians who found it. Now, the Japanese fleet actually outnumbered the American fleet that was firing upon it here. Lots and lots of shells were fired, torpedoes, and again, we're looking at horrible, miserable weather, and maybe not the best fighting conditions, and I would imagine, not having found any reference to this, having a bunch of ships fighting it out in the middle of a volcanic island chain where there would bound to be a bunch of reefs and pointy things sticking up everywhere. It would be rather distracting. Anyway, as it turned out, the American fleet actually got the worst of this, but the Japanese, not knowing if there were bombers on the way or what damage they had inflicted on the U.S., withdrew. And with that withdrawal began the Japanese problems of the islands, because now supplying the troops on the islands became more and more difficult, and they eventually started to supply them by submarine. Brings me back to the submarines here again, because I think the subs may be the key to why the Japanese wanted these islands. You cannot supply with a miniature submarine, and obviously they didn't. They obviously brought larger submarines with supplies, which would be able to get into, or at least very close to, the harbors. There were harbors there, so no reason why they couldn't dock all the way in, as American submarines indeed had done before and after this battle. I digress. Now, the Japanese also had a dozen of A6M2 roof fighters. That's a float plane variation of the Zero, sort of interesting, stationed there for air cover. And they also had 6 H-6K flying boats that flew anti-submarine and shipping patrols. Finally, on May 11th, 1943, Kinkaid believed it was time. He had taken nearby islands, placing Air Force components close by. He had built his strength up to some 83 or 84,000 in the Alaskan Command. He had dropped 600 tons of bombs on the islands, and it was about that time. So, May 11th, he landed 11,000 amphibious Marines, soldiers, on the islands. However, they were not that well prepared for the extremely hostile terrain, for the extremely hostile weather, and the extremely tenacious and hostile Japanese occupying force that contested every single inch of soil there was. This was a snapshot of what was to come with the island hopping campaigns of the Pacific, where the Japanese fought for every inch of soil they could and died where they were if they had to. Same thing was here. Against 11,000 Americans landing, there was only 2,500 defenders, but they fought really, really hard. And it took the Americans almost over 2 weeks to finally get them cornered and take that island back. It resulted in the Japanese being pushed back to the further corner of the island, and the last Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuryu Yamasaki, led the largest banzai charge of the Pacific campaign against the Americans. I don't have a number of how many there were. There must have been over several hundreds at that point. And they charged the American lines. They overran the outer defenses. They made it all the way into the rear and the supply areas before they were finally stopped and killed or surrendered, as a few of them did. But it was for naught. Interesting note is there was one Japanese sailor who actually survived and managed to hide on this island and escape and survive for several months on grass and worms before realizing this really was not the way to go, and he surrendered. And if you imagine you have no shelter, you're on the middle of a rock island with no trees and no nothing, and making that for a couple of months, maybe he should teach survival courses afterwards. I wonder what happened to him. Don't have a name on that. Anyway, after Attu had been taken, the Americans had to regroup and think about this, because this battle was a lot harder and more costly than it should have been. So before charging on to Kiska, it was time for a proper blockade and assembling a lot more troops, all the way up to 35,000 troops preparing for the assault on Kiska, because this was not going to cost just like it did on Attu. They ringed the island and bombed it mercilessly every day they could, weather permitting. And even on the 22nd of July, you had several old battleships that conducted offshore bombing of the Japanese defenders. And they were set ready for an invasion to launch in mid-August, after they presumably had flattened and bombed and pancaked this island into submission. Remember, there was also a blockade, naval blockade of the island, which is rather interesting, because the Japanese had some 5,200 men on Kiska. Initially, the Japanese tried to rescue some of these, and 820 men was taken off by I-boats, and 7 of the 13, however, were sunk or damaged, and some of the destroyers offshore were also damaged. But under cover of fog, they managed to deliver from the American blow the remaining of the 5,200 men and sneak them off under the cover of fog. They made it through the blockade. They took everybody off the island, and when the American forces landed, there were no Japanese defenders left, which must be said, in the middle of a naval blockade at a hostile island under constant fire and bombardment, for the Japanese to manage to rescue some 5,000 sailors off these islands must be seen as quite one of the rescues of the war, and I would love to look more into that. Just saying. So that was pretty much the setup. They landed, they held the islands for a bit more than a year, and then they were kicked off. What was the point of all that? And this is where historians come up with all sorts of interesting suggestions and wild-fetched speculations that this was a precursor to an invasion of the American mainland. And I bring up the map. Doesn't look plausible now, does it? The Japanese could not even hold on to Pearl Harbor. If they had wanted to invade Pearl Harbor, it was at the very edge envelope of the logistical supply chain. So what was the point? That probably was not the point. Was it to divert forces away from the ongoing Battle of Midway? Well, the Battle of Midway was always going on, but you would think this was a fairly well-planned operation on behalf of the Japanese. They were well supplied, the logistics was well in hand. It was not. It was closer to the Japanese mainland than it was to the American mainland, for one. But it must have been planned for quite some time, possibly even before the Battle of Midway had been envisioned, although Midway was also always a place the Japanese wanted. So it could have been just a mere diversion. Let's divert the Americans' attention up there while we're trying to take Midway, thinking that the 4 carriers they had at Midway was enough. Well, that could have been different circumstances, of course, and possibly if the Japanese Navy and Army in any which way could communicate or cooperate, might things have turned out different at Midway. However, they didn't, and here we are. Then we can look at, as always said, this was in order to protect the Japanese northern flank, which I will accept more as an explanation, especially since the Japanese were putting submarines up there. Quite some midget submarines were captured after the islands fell, which is a little strange, because a midget submarine has an active operational range of about 450 miles. They couldn't make it anywhere near the American mainland, and couldn't even make it back to Japan if they wanted to. So they could effectively, well, on kamikaze missions, they could reach out 450 miles just, hopefully, without having to expend fuel looking for a fleet. Honestly, the only reason I see Japanese midget submarines on this island was to attack the screening force, the embargo force of the American ships surrounding the island in order to break in or out. Because midget submarines couldn't chase around that ocean looking for prey. They couldn't make it anywhere near the US or anything else that really matters. They're only a local short-range defensive or offensive measure. So I'm thinking they could be resupplied by bigger submarines. So bigger submarines could, however, roam around for hundreds and hundreds of miles towards the American coast and effectively block off the American supplies or ships coming to and from San Francisco towards the Pacific. They could harry the Pacific Fleet from there if they were in sufficient number and well supplied, as they seem to, well, have intended to be, which makes so much more sense. So I think the reason why they did this was to position a whole lot of submarines out of there, which brings us back to what was the Japanese doctrine of war during World War II. What was their plan? What was the whole Pearl Harbor thing about? Which brings us back to Kantai-Kessen, the Japanese decisive battle doctrine, which basically said, and there's a great video that Drak did on the Kantai-Kessen that I'm not going to even remotely repeat, but it basically boils down to one massive naval battle at sea, sinking and defeating the enemy navy, and thus gaining control of the sea and the waterways, which would leave the enemy to surrender. there's some problems with this. A lot of problems with this, actually. But after the Battle of Tsushima against the Russian Navy at the turn of the century, where the Japanese Navy, on their own terms, had pretty much lured the Russian Navy all the way from the Black Sea and the Baltics up to the Straits of Tsushima, where they defeated and beat the Russian Navy far, far away from home, stretched logistics, close to the Japanese mainland and their own logistics, winning the war by sinking the Navy and taking some of the ships that had survived. That won the war. That's an interesting way of creating your doctrine, because the only way the Russians at that time really could wage war against Japan was with their navy. And if you sink their navy, the war is over. So if you make that a foundation for the Japanese naval doctrine of seeking to entice the enemy into coming your way, closer to you, in order to soundly defeat them and then end the war that way, well, that could work with a power like Russia at the turn of the century. Does not really work with a country like the United States, because if you sink our fleet, well, we'll build another one, and another one, and another one. And if you piss off the entire American nation by a sneak attack on our soil, on one of our bases, that's not really going to entice anybody to come out and seek peace or negotiated settlement after the fact. So what was the Japanese plan exactly here by the whole Japanese thing? Well, I guess if you sink the Pacific Fleet, the Americans had two fleets at the time, one Pacific on the other side, which would take a whole lot of time to come all the way around through the canals to make it to the Pacific, which would give the Japanese plenty of time to regroup. So the Japanese had to deal with the Pacific, and the concept was, if they had the numbers to defeat the American fleet as they would come after them closer to the Japanese homeland, well, Pearl Harbor made sense. If you remember, the idea was to believe that a naval defeat would give them control of the waterways, of the oceans and the logistics and the supplies, and then lead the enemy, America, to a negotiated settlement or to seeking peace. So bombing Pearl Harbor, taking out some of the fleet, and then leading the remains of that fleet to come after Japan closer to, say, Midway, closer to the Japanese islands, and shortening their own logistical supply chain to bring the American Navy into a decisive victory. And that seemed to be what the Japanese were constantly doing throughout World War II, looking for a decisive victory to beat the fleet, and then, well, and then what? That's the problem. It seems that there was a bit of a difference of opinions and thoughts in the Japanese higher command. And we are back to, again, the Japanese Navy, which had won this glorious war at Tsushima, and the Japanese army was gloriously fighting the Russians and the Chinese, but hadn't really managed to actually win anywhere out there. At this time, they had a negotiated settlement or ceasefire with the Russians in 42, so they didn't have to worry about that. But you have the Japanese Navy and the Japanese army, and they hated each other with a vengeance. In fact, it's said that the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army, they hated each other more than they hated their enemies. And even people within the Japanese Navy hated themselves, to the point where assassinations against officers were not uncommon in order to create advancements. But certainly there was, shall we mildly putting it, a hostility between the Japanese Army and Navy. And then you have the Navy Air Force and the Army Air Force, to the point where they didn't cooperate or coordinate, which certainly would account for what didn't happen at Midway. And the Aleutian Island campaign was a naval campaign with naval sailors that attacked and Marines that invaded. So the Navy had a decent plan. Don't know how that coincided, if the Army was even informed. I don't know. But what were they planning on doing up there? I think they were planning on maybe splitting the American forces, but certainly setting up bases where they could screen and harry convoys and fleets coming over the Pacific, because that was within range of submarines. It was closer to have a base and dock there. How long they thought this was going to work? Well, you know. But of course, you also had a wonderful propaganda of the fact that they put up their flag on one American island, say we invaded part of America, although that victory possibly got lost by the fact that they lost their carriers at Midway. It went in contradiction with what I think the perception of the Japanese battle doctrine was. They were seeking a decisive battle. Certainly not going to have a decisive battle in the Aleutian Islands. Well, okay, if you have 500 sailors that storm and take 10 American soldiers prisoner of the island, that's pretty decisive for that island. Not really for the overall strategic concern of the war. It was a sideshow. But maybe, this was a deliberate and rather well-considered plan by cooler heads in the Japanese Navy, whereabouts they could place a screening force and actually do some damage to American shipping and convoying, which they really did not do much of. America had far more submarines, they were more successful. If the Japanese could build and position submarines up there, they could do two-pronged attack on American supplies, which might actually have made a difference if they were able to hold on to these islands. Should probably have taken some islands without any occupants so they could have sit in there in secret. But it may have been a better plan from Japanese point of view than one would have thought. And since we're talking about Navy and using words like Pearl Harbor, there's one question I'm going to squeeze in there that I've gotten a few times. Do I believe the United States Command knew of the attack on Pearl Harbor was pending or coming? And I'm going to go rather firmly with yes. I do believe that there were members within the United States government that knew the Japanese were going to attack and bomb Pearl Harbor. That's pretty straightforward. And you say, why, fearless leader, do you believe such crazy conspiracy theories? I tell you, the British had broken the Japanese naval codes, and they read the Japanese messages. However, the British naval code messages that exists in the British archives are still classified of the week leading up to Pearl Harbor. And the British government at one point made a statement that it would not be good for international relationships to release these. That's pretty telling. It isn't it? Why was the carriers pulled out of Pearl just in time? Why were they not there right around that date? They had warnings that they didn't read. They had intercepts that was definitely pointing in that direction. They knew a Japanese fleet was roaming around somewhere that was missing. Churchill knew, and I'm pretty sure the American president, he knew. And he wanted to get into war with Germany, and he wanted to get into a war with Germany. And that's fairly well documented by his own statements. And the way to get to that was a war with Japan. I think there's more than enough circumstantial evidence to say that the American president, and certainly people with enough say to move pieces around the chessboard, knew that the Pearl Harbor attack was pending. And it is actually, I think I covered this in another Q&A rather in-depthly. Is that a word? In-depthly? Nah, anyway. It's not like the U.S. intelligence, or military, or government have not before neglected to share information or have events occur in order to get them into a decisive foreign policy entanglement. And I'm not seeing why Pearl Harbor was any different. Events leading up to World War I seemed orchestrated, and very few things happen out of accident and coincidence. And you could say, well, a lot of times when we go to war, it's because we want to, because we push our enemies in a direction we want to go, but they don't want to go, to the point where we know either they'll break or they'll attack. And if they attack, well, then we can go to war with them and get it our way the other way. I'm just saying, but when it comes to Pearl Harbor, I'm pretty damn sure somebody knew, and I'm certain that Churchill knew. And if he knew, he probably told somebody in the United States who also wanted this to happen. Anyway, that's my theory on that. And if the records are ever released, we'll see if I'm right or not. See if any of us are alive when that happens. So, that brings us to the last question that I wanted to go over, and we're going to talk about the evil, dastardly taking over the world, conspiracy, Masons. Yes, we will destroy and seek, and we have all the and I do laugh a little bit because I have a bunch of friends that are Freemasons today in the Blue Lodges, and honestly, and I love you guys, don't get me wrong, most of them couldn't plan and arrange for a picnic. Sorry. So the whole world dominating conspiracy, Illuminati out of the Masonic Blue Lodges. Yeah, no, I'm not seeing it. That's no. If you can't arrange for good food, you can't arrange to take over the world. That's just the way I look at it. Okay. And don't get me started on the conspiracy thoughts, because we all know I want to take over the world, at least for a while. And we would all be surrounded with good pastries and puppies, attractive women, and our enemies would be banished to Hawaii, shall we say. You know, for a while. Anyway, let's just, because of Brothers War, a movie that I don't really usually bring the movies and entertainment and TV stuff I do into my military Q&As, because they really don't have anything to do with each other. However, I have been drowning in comments over the past decade about the movie Brothers War. If you haven't seen it, pause this video, spend 98 minutes, watch Brothers War, and then come back to this, and then you can take part of the understanding of what I'm about to try to explain. Why it's all Masonic conspiracies and all that nonsense. Working our way backwards, the Freemasons are basically they're the largest fraternity in the world. They are a bunch of dudes who get together once a month and talk about what money to give charity to. Pretty much. And there's a few things you have. For every state there's a Grand Lodge, for every country there's a Grand Lodge. For larger countries, every region have a Grand Lodge. They're all Masons, but they're not necessarily, they may have slightly different charters, but this is, imagine a large worldwide college fraternity where there's a few rules, and I think the rules are important to note on when it comes to Freemasonry. Is one, in the lodges, you're not allowed to talk about politics or religion. And well, if you take politics and religion out of it, there's not a whole lot of world-ranging conspiracies left to work on. Am I saying that there are not people that have interesting designs on world domination that happen to be Masons? No. Or through history have not had so? No. I don't know. Unfortunately, I haven't met any. I'll volunteer to take over the world any day. So if there's a good conspiracy, other than this, my State Department maybe, I think the closer thing to a world-ranging conspiracy to take over world domination and change the world would be bureaucrats and political bureaucrats and around the world. I'm sure there is a bureaucratic fraternity somewhere, but I'm pretty sure the Freemasons aren't it. Anyway, going back to the Masons, family comes first, work comes first, country comes first. You have to believe in a supreme being in order to be a Mason. In other words, you can't be an atheist. It doesn't matter, all religions are welcome. There are Muslim Masons, there are Jewish Masons, there are Christian Masons, there are Catholic Masons. All the Catholics did spend quite a time of history trying to eradicate and kill the Freemasons, and we reverse back to the Knights Templar. You also had, everybody screams about the Illuminati, which was a group that existed for 10 years in Austria. Did they go underground and try to take over the world? I don't know, but I'm going back to what the theme of the movie was, and where all the questions have come in, was what happened to German Freemasons during and before World War II. Freemasonry being a fraternity, just like a union, was not exactly looked upon kindly after the National Socialists or the Nazis came to power in 1933, and a lot of them started dissolving, going underground, hiding, and eventually became persecuted. And I figured, well, that's kind of an interesting story, because I wanted to do a movie on the Eastern Front. Well, because I could, because I had a bunch of friends who had a bunch of Russian tanks, and knew a bunch of people that reenacted, German and Russian especially. We've all heard the American point of view inside of World War II, British, French. In Russia, they have heard the Russian point of view of World War II. Russian movies are actually quite good, production-wise, but some of them are, they are very patriotic. And there's nothing wrong with a country making patriotic movies. Every country, love the country you're from, be proud of it, no problem. But be willing and ready to admit its flaws. And I'm saying that to my Russian commenters, which are very offended that I have, in the movie, portrayed Russians as in a way where they were killing German prisoners of war. Well, guess what? They did. Sorry. In fact, the Germans killed Russian prisoners of war. The Americans killed German prisoners of war. French. Everybody did horrible things during World War II. It doesn't mean that everybody was a horrible person. Certainly not every German that fought during World War II fought for Hitler or fought for the National Socialists. Quite interestingly enough, a lot of them fought for their country, and some of them fought because they kind of had to hide. And some of those dudes were Freemasons that went on to serve in the army to hide their Masonic past. There was 200,000 or 300,000 of Jewish descent that fought and hid in the German army. There were Jews that hid in the SS, hiding from persecution. So the army and the foreign SS were, well, they took volunteers, and the German army obviously did. And before the war, in 1924, there was 385,000 German Masons. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he did not outlaw the Masons just like that, like we've been told. That order did not come down until 1935. But a lot of things had to happen before then. It wasn't that easy, that straightforward. But I wanted to do a movie where the subplot was a couple of Masons that were chased by the Gestapo on the Eastern Front in the middle of what was also the Russian purging of the Polish government in exile, and the and again, well, I'm sorry, dear Russian friends, you did. The Russian NKVD killed 24,000 Polish officers in 1941 in the Katyn Forest that we've all heard of. Although this was not noted at the trial of Nuremberg, and don't let me get into a whole rant about the Nuremberg trials and the legal improprieties that went on there. But we'll get back to that at the end. There's a couple of interesting notes as it comes to Masonry and the Nuremberg trials. But the Russian NKVD had Stalin had no intention of giving up Poland after he took it. That's pretty much factual. So towards the end of the war, if there were Polish politicians and dissenters that might oppose him after the war, some of these were eliminated. There was a detachment of Polish government officials in exile that flew in 1945 to see Stalin because he wanted to negotiate about the post-war Poland, and they flew in a Lancaster from England to Moscow, and none of them were ever seen alive again. And that's the event I allude to in the movie that our two protagonists are witnessing. Back to the Masonic stuff. But that's the movie. Everything in Brothers War, whether you like it or not, is inspired by real events, by things that really happened. And I will say one more thing on the Russian atrocities. Like I said, Germans did some horrible things, Russians did, everybody did. But when you go to film school, they always tell you, don't do an Eastern Front movie because there are no good guys. Well, true, and a lot of bad things happened there, and well, fortunately, no one told me about that until after I did the movie, so bite me. The problem on the East Front was no one had signed on to any of the treaties governing prisoners of war, and the Red Cross was on trucks was often used for target practice. It was a horrible, miserable give-no-quarter front where horrible things happened, and that led all the way into atrocities happened after the war ended with those who fought on the Eastern Front. The very first account on atrocities on the Eastern Front I read in General Hoth's diary that took place on the second day of Barbarossa, where after a Russian counterattack had overrun a German field hospital and killed and mutilated everybody, they had been pushed back and all these bodies were found. So on the second day of Barbarossa, it was now known that there was no quarter given from the Russian side, and thus none was given or expected from the German side. And that just spiraled into nightmare. And when you then had the Russian partisans doing their thing behind the front lines, it just became a nightmarish slaughter where nobody really wanted to be taken prisoner, because one thing is, if you were lucky, you would just be killed. And that I depict in some way in the movie, although we're following one German protagonist. I don't know who's banging, but it is really annoying. Sorry, I'm not in control of my neighbors. Anyway, that was part of the story on there. So one of the 800 other questions I got on Brothers War was, well, what was the deal with the German Masons during World War II? In Germany at the time, just like in America where you have a Grand Lodge for every state, there were several different Grand Lodges. There was the Grand Old Prussian Lodge, and then there were 6 humanitarian lodges. Don't read too much into the names. I'm going to not go esoteric and just tell you the nuts and bolts of logistics, because that's the question. If you want to go into their readings and studies, and Masonry apparently is a lot about exchange of history and study and learning and charity, especially today. I'm not saying that Masonry did not have a far stronger influence and in Washington's day and 100 years ago than it does now. Certainly Masonry had more of an impact through the important people that were Masons. Now, were they Masons because they were important people, or were they important people because they were Masons? That's kind of hard to tell if they're one or the other. Now, the distinction between those two separate entities of lodges were the old Prussian lodges did not accept Jews into their organization because they saw the Masonic craft as one of Christian character only. Then you had the humanitarian lodges that did, because they saw no distinction between Christians and Jews as long as you believed in a higher deity, you could become a Mason. And then because they're all affiliated, if you were Jewish and you joined one of the humanitarian lodges, you could then visit the Prussian craft lodge. So really didn't mean much. However, that began to mean more later in the day. Because after World War I, there was the notion spread, the stab in the back legend, that Jewish bankers, Bolsheviks, Freemasons had rallied together and cost Germany the war. And that Jewish Freemasons were part of the reason why Germany was defeated. The National Socialists jumped on to this bit of propaganda quite readily and used it, and that was regurgitated in various degrees throughout the decades leading up to Hitler's takeover of power. And if you look at these charges, let's just take one. It was always said that the Jewish Mason Karl Marx conspired to destroy Germany and take over the world. Now, right here we have a problem. Karl Marx, of many, many things he was a nutcase. If you ever read his writings, he was batshit nuts. He was. Communism, and his version of communism, is just insane if you actually read it. And Lenin always said, socialism is a step towards communism, only as a springboard. And what does communism do? It is a dictatorship, just like National Socialism is a dictatorship, where the idea of secret lodges or people meeting in secret or secret societies, I don't know why we keep saying Freemasons are a secret society, because everybody knows and everybody can join. So it's not really much more secret than that. However, communists outlawed and chased off the Freemasons just as well as the Nazis did. So the thought that Marx was a Freemason is absolutely ridiculous, because it runs counter to his world communist view. And when I say, by the way, anybody can join, anybody can. You just have to, we're back to what is Freemasonry. You can't be a criminal. You have to be a good upstanding citizen in your country, in the community. You have to do good things. You have to be a positive influence on others. Which brings us back to, well, what type of person were joining the Masonic lodges back in Germany? Well, Jews were not even allowed to have full-fledged citizenship until 1880, 1890 out in Germany. So, yes, Jews were always persecuted by everybody. And there was always that stigma, which is why the Prussian lodges did not want to allow Jews into the lodge. The more progressive lodges said, fine. So there was not really ever an abundance of Jews in the German lodges, because there couldn't have been, because they wouldn't even have been allowed to join until maybe around the turn of the century. And again, who's joining? Middle class to upper class people are joining, people with jobs, because you need to take a little time off to do this. Good standing, good character. Soldiers, especially soldiers, came back from World War I, where after the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of soldiers were now unemployed with nowhere to go, and soldiers like fraternities, which is why a lot of soldiers and police officers and firefighters, they like their Masonic lodges, because it's a place where like-minded people can get together and talk and exchange ideas and do their things. Which every fraternity really is a bunch of like-minded people getting together and having a drink and a meal and exchanging ideas. Masonry was open to that. So seeing communists in lodges who had a different philosophy was kind of nonsense, and it really was nonsense, because it is not ideas that work well together. You had a lot of government officials, as we will see, that was Masons in Germany. So as it turned out, a lot of this propaganda that kept flourishing in the 20s and 30s about Masons and being Jews and communists and anti-Germans were so silly that the Prussian Grand Lodges did not even acknowledge it. And here's the problem they started to have. the Masonic lodges started having problems decades before Hitler came to power. National Socialist propaganda started in 1923, and it expanded, and a lot of different groups in Germany united over this National Socialist viewpoint, and they jumped onto the anti-Jewish, anti-Masonic point of view, where the two were labeled together, and no effort PR-wise was done to separate the lodge's fact and fiction. And that meant that increasingly so, the Prussian lodges ignored this anti-Masonic propaganda as silly, but it grew in mindset because a good conspiracy is much better than a boring truth, right? So we can pretty much see that these days. And that, of course, meant that now there's fewer and fewer people that was going to join the lodges because they don't want to get involved in this, because they see the public stigma. And as the National Socialists came to power, you were faced with a choice. If you're a Mason, you may not get a job, you may not get hired, you may not be able to advance. So more and more people left the lodges, not by decree by the Nazis, but by the simple demand that the National Socialists, and even before Hitler came to power, if you become ostracized more and more from everyday life and professional life. So that, plus the arguments between the Prussian lodge and the humanitarian lodges, which meant that at the time Hitler came to power, they were not even on speaking terms. They were at such disagreements with how to handle all the things that were going on, that when Hitler came to power, the humanitarian lodges, they just turned key, pulled plug, and saw this writing on the wall, we're done. They closed the lodges and dissolved. The Prussian lodges, they tried, because, believe it or not, most Masons are rather conservative and patriotic people. And I'm sure they were at the same time in Germany as well. So the Prussian lodges, they tried to negotiate with the National Socialists between 1933 to 1935 to be allowed to exist. They renounced some of their Jewish or Judean-inspired rituals. They changed their names to reflect National Socialist sentiments. They wrote the Kaiser, they wrote Hitler, they wrote Goering, which is interesting because rumors say Goering was a Mason, or at the very least he was on the way to become one. Certainly Himmler would have had some interest in the Masonic rituals, because Himmler had a great interest in the occult and esoteric in general. Interestingly enough, they had just joined and had figured out for themselves what these lodges were all about. But the Prussian lodges, they fought on to try to turn themselves into acceptable entities for the National Socialists. They were still raided and picked on, and it really didn't work because the writing was on the wall. And in 1935, a decree was put out that all lodges had to dissolve and denounce, and Gestapo officials were present at the meetings where the lodges were closed, and so on and so forth. And they did, and those who had renounced their Freemasonry membership before 1933 were allowed to stay in the jobs they had, but they would not be allowed for promotion. The ones who had tried to join the National Socialist Party or got a job after would be fired or let go. Also, you couldn't join the National Socialist Party, you couldn't join the Nazi Party organizations if you were a Freemason, which led to another problem, was that a lot of people joined the Nazi Party because they wanted to advance. Not as much because they bought into the National Socialist viewpoint, worldview, but because, well, these are the new kids on town, they're the cool kids, we got to join them so we can expand our business and for job opportunities. So here another again is German Masons were pretty much fired on from all sides and closed off from opportunities because they couldn't do anything. Now, of course, there wasn't as such a national charter of Freemasonry, so there wasn't a list of everybody. And the lodges where they were able to burn and destroy all the records, nobody knew who had been a Mason, making it easier for Masons to hide or forget that past. The ones who were discovered after 1935 and on was labeled as political prisoners and had a red triangle and sent to the camps with the communists and socialists. So they were sent to the camp. Some died there, and a lot others, well, they burnt the membership cards and disappeared into the army, which has brought us back to Brothers War, because I thought that was an interesting subplot, really, because no one really knew what happened to Freemasons. No one even really seemed to know what Freemasons were doing at the time. Well, they were trying to stay alive, and they were trying to survive the Nazis. And I don't have any impression from anything I've read or seen that there were any Masonic resistance groups or counter-Nazi endeavors or plans in any which way, bringing us back to, well, the Masonic Charter says you don't talk politics or religion. So they really wouldn't be at odds with anybody, but they had been tainted and now labeled and now closed, even though, like I said, in Prussia, they tried everything they could to make amends and turn themselves into good National Socialists first and Freemasons latter. Did not work. Another interesting part, so a lot of the memorabilia from the lodges were compiled and put into Masonic museums in Berlin, and the secretary of those were Adolf Eichmann, before he was transferred over onto Jewish affairs, interestingly enough. Just a little tidbit there. All this memorabilia were removed by the Russians when they took Berlin and moved back to Russia, to Moscow, where it is probably sitting in an archive somewhere, or a large archive somewhere. I do not have any information if any of this had been given back. I heard some had been returned to the lodges after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but I don't have any confirmation on that, and it's not really here or there. But anyway, that was about the story of the German Freemasons during World War II, and before, and a little bit of how and what and why, and a little bit about what Freemasons actually are. I'm not saying that there are not people that are Masons that are doing things. And certainly if you look at, and I covered that in the Q&A before, World War I, there was a lot of things that were sort of set up by bankers on both sides working together. And certainly it's not unthinkable that some of these bankers were Jewish and Freemasons as well. So one could say, well, they were people that were Jewish, that were bankers, that were Freemasons, that conspired to start World War I and end it, and on to World War II. Well, did they do whatever they might have done because they were Masons, or did they do that and then they happened to be Masons as well? I think that's probably more possible. If anybody of the big political lodges in Washington wish to invite me and enlighten me on what they do out there, I would love to visit and give you guys my impressions. But from the Masons I know, they're a bunch of older good dudes that are just trying to do some good. They give $2.2 billion to charity every year, so, and that's what I know. If there's some super upper class world conspiracy masonry somewhere, I haven't seen it. I'll take the invitation if I get to run the world for a little while. Anyway, that was the Brothers War questions answered. If you got any more, let me know. Editorial. I have a question for all of you that I need you to think about, good, hard, and serious. As I spend a lot of time traveling around, especially Europe and Eastern Europe, looking at battlefields and forts and Invading and Wolf's Lair and Ostwald and Maginot Line, all these different forts, and I started thinking up an idea, a plan. I would like to start arranging tours 2-4 times a year where groups of 20 of us will meet in Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, jump on a bus and go around to all these places and spend a couple of days in each. I'll show you everything I found, go through the battlefields and see what remains. And I'm thinking about 2-week tours, maybe a couple of $1,000 a person. Should cover hotels and food as well, at least the minimal. Is that something you guys would be interested in? Not just write me and say, yes, that's a great idea, and then not show up. Is that something you guys would actually be interested in and then showing up for? Because I figure people with 10 or 20 is a good sized group. $1,000, $2,000 for a couple of weeks in seeing European battlefields and forts is not overly expensive. I haven't done the math yet, but that's kind of where I think it's going to land, some between 1 and 2. And then all expenses got to be covered. Spring and autumn. Anyway, write me your thoughts on that one, because I'm kind of curious if that's something I would like to do, and I would like to show you guys in reality what it is I see out there. And remember, next week my 5 episodes on the East Wall is going to start. It's going to be the long, everyday, everything I see as I see it, with some great guys out there, and there's a little trail about the East Wall, what it actually is, will come up after here. And send me your questions, lostbattlefields.com, where all the photos for all these episodes are, military history Q&A at mail.com. And I will see you as soon as I can. Have a great day.
My name is Tino Struckmann. I'm a military historian, and I want to show you one of the most impressive fortified lines I've ever seen, the Ostwald in Poland. In 1934, Adolf Hitler directed funds, pioneer battalions, and civilian construction crews to begin construction of the Ostwald. A series of border fortifications facing Poland, they were to be a vast defensive line with a series of large reinforced concrete bunkers complemented by a huge network of underground tunnels. On January 19, 1945, the Russian offensive finally struck, and after 3 days of the fiercest fighting of the war, the line broke. However, not without taking a very heavy toll on the Red Army. Many of the forts were blown up during the fighting or after, yet many still remains today, and they are an impressive sight, and especially the tunnels underneath. Let me show you.